be taking the most of the time here because we have a guest of honor. We have Professor Robert Mnookin from Harvard, from the negotiation project at Harvard, quite well known within conflict resolution circles. Bob here has been contributing widely to the literature on conflict resolution through a number of books and journal articles, but he's also engaged in conflict resolution in a variety of contexts, from political ones to commercial contexts, and I'm sure we will be hearing more about that. We have one commentator for this seminar, which is our very own Scott Gates, director of the Center for the Study of Civil War here at PRIO. We will go about this in a rather informal way. We will be leaving now the floor to Professor Mnookin to speak for some 35-40 minutes before we have the comment by Scott Gates, and then we open up the floor to questions and comments from the audience. I also want to recognize the assistance of the ambassador of the US, Barry White, who is sitting here at the front in establishing the contact with Professor Mnookin and hence making today's seminar possible. But with these words, welcome again to all of you, and a particular welcome, of course, to Bob Mnookin, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here in Oslo and to be at PRIO. Needless to say, here, but I want to report that the Peace Research Institute of Oslo is extremely well known in America and is one of the handful of the leading research institutes in the world dealing with negotiation and conflict. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Christian Hartgen for making that possible, and my college classmate, and he was 1 year my better, Barry White, Ambassador White, for acting as the matchmaker in this enterprise. I have to confess, I find it very difficult to refer to Barry as Ambassador White, but I'm getting used to it. All right, I'm getting used to being called that. What I wanted to talk to you about today is some ideas from my last book. And in fact, the title of the book is what I... Okay.
Yeah, we'll just put it right there.
We'll just leave it right there. The title of the book is Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. And it really addresses the following question. Should you bargain with the devil? Now, interestingly enough, the founding director of PRIO wrote an article some 30 or 40 years ago that had the word devil in its title. And in fact, I think it was more addressed to peace researchers and people who might play a mediational role. But I found that quite interesting and a fascinating coincidence. In terms of this issue, I perhaps should define some terms. What do I mean by bargain? What I mean by bargain is attempt to resolve a conflict through negotiation rather than resisting or fighting it out. You might say more importantly, who's the devil? What do I mean by the devil? Now, I don't literally believe in the devil, but for my purposes, what I mean by devil is an adversary who has hurt you in the past, whom you fear may well hurt you in the future, someone you don't trust, and someone you may feel is evil. Now, in these quarters, like in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's not fashionable these days to talk about evil, particularly among professionals concerned with dispute resolution. The word, after all, has religious overtones, and arguably there's no stable definition of what it means that something is evil. Some believe, indeed, the notion of evil is entirely subjective, and it's only a perception that people commonly perceive acts or individuals or regimes as evil. Indeed, in many ways, in our field, I think there's almost an air of taboo because the term evil is considered slippery and explosive, and it's much overused and sometimes loosely deployed and too often exploited by political leaders or religious leaders to malign their enemies and lead their followers into battle. I agree that these dangers exist. But in my book, early on, I really asked myself, is it a meaningful concept or not? And I ended up concluding, in fact, I offer a definition of evil acts. I said an evil act is an act in which a person or regime intentionally inflicts, without adequate justification, grievous harm on other human beings. Now, I want to acknowledge, as a law professor, some of those terms are not self-defining. What is grievous harm? What might or might not be an adequate justification? But I guess my own feeling is one can't look back at the last century and think the notion of evil is irrelevant. What the Tutsis did, what happened with the Tutsis and the Hutus was evil. The Nazi regime was evil. I think the present North Korean regime, in many respects, is evil. Indeed, I really embarked on this project after 9/11 because I think 9/11 involved an evil act, and I think more relevant to you, and I know this country has struggled with this, July 22nd involved evil acts. I find somewhat preposterous that the notion that we would medicalize Breivik's condition and call him insane. I think people who are driven to do those kinds of violent acts against innocents, where it's driven by ideology, are not necessarily insane, but I think, in fact, they're performing evil acts. Now, the issue, should you bargain with the devil, in other words, should you negotiate with someone whom you distrust, you fear, you may even think is evil, what struck me when I began this project is that it is a question that, in fact, political leaders face. Interestingly enough, in my own experience, it can arise in commercial disputes, and indeed it can even arise in family disputes. Because in conflicts across these domains, you see demonization. Norway may be different, but with American audiences, I often ask, if you consider your own family and include cousins and go back a generation or down a generation and ask, have there been conflicts where family members have stopped speaking to each other because of the conflict, where there's been that kind of demonization? I will ask, how many of you in your family know of such a conflict? Well, it's about the same. I find about 40%. you know, typically. Well, at least 40 are honest about it. I don't know. Sometimes these family conflicts can arise, of course, in the context of divorce. They can often arise in conflicts over family property, where the family property may be a portrait or sometimes a business, but it doesn't matter what the stakes are. And in terms of national leaders, the issue of in what ways and to what extent should the United States be engaging with North Korea, with Iran, with Hamas, with Hezbollah? I mean, these kinds of questions come up all the time. And indeed, I gather that in the last months there was a little bit of a furor here in Norway because your foreign minister initially said he hadn't had contact with Hamas, and it turned out he had had contact with Hamas. And so there are these issues that come up. And in business, too, having had a fair amount of experience in commercial mediation, where there have been fights, for example, over intellectual property, where one company thinks a competitor has stolen and misappropriated its intellectual property, or that there's been a joint venture that's failed, and there's now the commercial equivalent of a divorce. I can assure you there are conflicts of a sort where the leader on one or both sides may say, not simply for tactical reasons, but for deeply felt emotional reasons, we will not negotiate. We're going to fight this out in court. So the question I really wanted to explore is, how do you think about this issue of deciding whether to negotiate or not? And as you are probably aware, there are categorical answers to this question. One set of categorical answers, which I myself have probably at times earlier in my career been guilty of, is the notion that one should always be prepared to negotiate. Being willing to negotiate doesn't mean you're going to compromise what's most important to yourself. What it means, at the program on negotiation, we've long championed interest-based negotiation, where you try to engage in a process of collaborative problem solving, where you try to find out what's vitally important to both sides, and you see if you can't create options that might make both better off than their best alternative away from the table. As an American lawyer, I can report to you that litigation is a horrifically inefficient, expensive way of resolving conflict, which typically destroys relationships. My friend Ambassador White, I think, was a business lawyer who headed his law firm, and I guarantee you, most of us who ever were business lawyers always were encouraging clients to try to work it out through negotiation instead of litigation. In the international arena, surely resolving conflict diplomatically is to be preferred to warfare. And so what one categorical answer is, you should always be prepared to negotiate. You should always try to negotiate. There is a categorical answer the other way, and that really connects up with what you all know about the Faustian bargain. I mean, the story here goes, you should not bargain with the devil. The devil is not only evil, but he's probably more clever than you are, and certainly more unscrupulous. The devil may offer you something that you very much want, but making a deal with the devil risks soiling your soul, or, less metaphysically, asking you to sacrifice values to which you ought to really remain committed. Now, not surprisingly perhaps, but as a law professor, I'm pretty skeptical of categorical claims. It's usually possible to find examples that can embarrass categorical claims. And what I might ask each of you to do is think for a moment, and we all have different answers to this, who were your two, in the 20th century, the last century, who were your two greatest political heroes? Well, here are mine. Winston Churchill and Nelson Mandela. And in my book, I have a chapter about each. Churchill is my hero because in May of 1940, he refused to negotiate. Although you won't find a word about this in his magisterial multi-volume history of World War II, because this is not part of the British narrative of our finest hour. But in late May of 1940, for 4 days, the British War Cabinet debated whether or not to pursue the possibility of having Mussolini act as a mediator to end the war. Churchill had just become, in fact, on May 10th, Prime Minister. And indeed, May 10th was the day that both Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands were invaded. Indeed, Chamberlain, who had been Prime Minister, his government, it didn't fall because, in fact, it got a majority vote in Parliament. But after the end of the phony war, after Norway had been invaded, of course, earlier, on April 9th of 1940, Churchill was asked to become Prime Minister. His war cabinet included, as Foreign Minister, Halifax, and it included Chamberlain as well. And Halifax and the Italian ambassador to Great Britain, a man named Bastiani, dreamt up a scheme where Mussolini might mediate. Italy was not yet in World War II. Italian forces were massed in the part of Italy very close to Nice, and they were getting ready to enter France to claim part of the spoils. And in fact, there was a desire on the part of both the French and the British, if possible, to keep Italy out of the war. But most fundamentally, Halifax thought one ought to pursue the possibility of having Mussolini mediate. Well, for 4 days, that was debated. And about a decade ago, the minutes of those war cabinet meetings were released. And they make for extremely interesting reading. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details with you now, but I'd be glad to answer any questions about it. But let me report that Churchill made a lot of lousy arguments. He also made what I thought ultimately was a very powerful argument. And in all events, he is my hero because he chose at a time when the Soviet Union, of course, had, in what was the most cynical deal of all times, the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Soviet Union was not in the war, and indeed was in some ways on the other side, in some ways. The United States, our ambassador to Great Britain at the time, was President Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, who has a deserved reputation for being something of a defeatist. He was urging that the British be told to send the fleet to Canada because he thought British goose was soon to be cooked, and they might as well save the fleet. And the United States, at this point, had not provided substantial aid to Great Britain. France was teetering on the edge. The Netherlands had been overrun. Belgium had capitulated, was capitulating at this time. Norway, of course, although in some ways, I guess, officially, it didn't all end until the end of May. The British, about this time, were asking that in Norvik, they take the port briefly, do some damage, and then evacuate. It was, in fact, a very dark time for Great Britain. And Churchill chose not to negotiate, but to resist. Mandela's story, and Mandela is probably my greatest hero of the 20th century. He's my hero because he chose to negotiate. In 1985, having already been in prison 20 years for treason, because he had been head of the terrorist branch of the African National Congress. And although, and he had actually participated, not necessarily, it's not clear that he killed anybody, but there had been some bombings that he had participated in. He'd been convicted of treason in '64, and he was wondering whether it wasn't time to initiate talks. Now, at this time, the African National Congress, to which he had devoted his life, had a clearly stated policy, and that is there would be no negotiations with the South African government and the hated National Party, which had erected the apartheid regime, unless certain preconditions were first met. And as is often the case, when people don't want to negotiate, you just establish preconditions that, in fact, require the other side to give you everything you want before you start talking to them. The United States is in a habit of, at times, doing this as well. But the preconditions were that all political prisoners be released, that the ANC and the Communist Party be unbanned, and that the apartheid regime be dismantled. And if those preconditions were met, then the ANC would be prepared to talk about what the terms of a new constitutional government might be. The National Party had set up as a precondition, in fact, they had offered to release Mandela any number of times, but on the condition that he renounce violence. And Mandela had steadfastly refused. Well, in this context, Mandela secretly wrote a letter to a man named Kutsi, who was the Minister of Justice, inviting talks about talks. He asked himself, his memoir, I commend to you, it's a marvelous book. He asked himself, should I do this? Should I adopt this strategy without consulting with the ANC leadership? Before I did research for this book, I had thought, because Mandela was the best known, that he was in fact the head of the ANC. He was not. Oliver Tambo was president of the ANC, and he was in exile in Lusaka, Zambia. And Mandela asked himself, should I write to Tambo and get his advice on this? Now, it was not easy for him to write to Tambo, but they regularly communicated, often secretly through Mandela's lawyer could get information in and out. And even if he didn't talk to Tambo, he had colleagues in the same prison with him whom he saw regularly, including Walter Sisulu, who was his mentor. And he asked himself, quite apart from whether I write Tambo, should I consult with Sisulu? The ANC had something of a culture that they decided things collaboratively, almost communally. And in a very moving passage, he said, no, I decided I was not going to ask. Why wouldn't I ask? Because I knew what their answer would be. You must not invite negotiations. And in quite a moving passage, he says, sometimes a shepherd must be ahead of the flock. And so he reached out and initiated negotiations with the devil. And the National Party, this party, had in fact been responsible for erecting what can only be characterized as an evil regime. So there you have it, my two heroes. One a hero because he refused to negotiate, another a hero because he chose to negotiate. And so what seems conspicuous to me is that the challenge is how do you make wise decisions in a particular context, whether or not to initiate negotiations. Because I don't think there are categorical answers. And I think that my book really involves 9 stories involving situations, some international, some commercial, some in families, where people were confronted with a difficult choice whether or not to negotiate. And the reason it's hard to make wise decisions is because, particularly when you view an adversary in these terms, as someone who might hurt you, who's someone you may think is evil, it provokes very strong emotions. And there are a variety of negative traps that I think get in the way of clear thinking and can cloud clear thinking. Moreover, deciding whether to negotiate involves implicitly making predictions about what might happen in the future, predictions about which there's enormous uncertainty. And there's always great uncertainty. And finally, and I'll say a word or two about this later, choosing whether or not to negotiate at times can involve deep moral quandaries, quandaries that pose issues about deep value issues, about whether one is a consequentialist or has more deontological views of what's right and wrong. Now, luckily, in my book, I introduce some of us are old enough to recognize this guy. This is Mr. Spock, not Dr. Spock. Mr. Spock, I'm using Mr. Spock only half in jest, is someone who has profound emotional self-control. I use him as kind of someone who's a consummate rational actor, wants to assess the costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. Great emotional self-control. And Mr. Spock is very sensitive to a variety of traps that I identify in my book that I think get in the way of clear thinking in these kinds of conflicts. One is demonization. And by demonization, I mean characterizing a person not as someone who may have committed an evil act, but someone who's inherently evil. Psychologists have done, a colleague of mine, well, social psychologists talk of what's called the fundamental attribution error. And the argument is that in terms of the way we think and react often, human beings, particularly if we're negatively impacted by the actions of someone else, infer that the behavior of the other person was because of a trait, that it didn't have much to do with context. That something inherent in them is what most likely led to it. Interestingly, in terms of the fundamental attribution error, when we come to judge our own behavior, we're all enormously expert of acknowledging, well, you know, I didn't really tell the truth then, but you have to understand the context. I was under a lot of pressure. I didn't have time to think about it. We all are very good at using contextual explanations to let ourselves off the hook. Well, demonization is kind of the strongest kind of an inherent characterization of some other person, where you say they're inherently evil. Other traps involve tribalism. We all know what that is, our team versus their team. Tribalism exists within companies. It can exist, families can be tribal. And of course, nations, state can be very tribal. Dehumanization, the worst kind of atrocities often involve situations where a people is characterized as no longer being part of the human race. They're cockroaches, they're vermin. And of course, if you dehumanize someone, none of the moral constraints that normally apply to restrain our behavior will necessarily apply. Moralism, right is entirely on my side, the other side's entirely wrong. Zero-sum fallacy, we all know about that in my negotiation teaching. Many people come to all negotiations and they think about it in zero-sum terms. What Christian wins, I lose. What I win, Christian loses. In fact, the program of negotiation, we very much encourage people to look for options that expand the pie and that create value. And then finally, there's the fight and flight impulse, emotional impulse, as well as the call to battle. Within organizations, within nations, once a decision is made to fight, it can be hard internally to continue to dissent. Well, Spock has a number of questions that he urges that people ask, and I'm not going to go through them in any detail here, but his questions essentially ask you to think hard about what your underlying interests are, what the other side's underlying interests are, what your alternatives away from the table are. What you're really trying to discover is, are there potential, and you of course haven't negotiated yet, are there potential negotiated outcomes that might make all concerned better off than fighting it out? I mean, for example, with respect to Iran, it is easy to think of a grand bargain where the West commits not to further trying to undermine the regime, where we offer all kinds of trade benefits, where they give up pursuit of the bomb and perhaps stop supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. And you could say, well, in terms of underlying interests, why wouldn't this be better? What you have to always worry about, of course, in any kind of context like this, is even if I make a deal, can it be implemented? It's one thing to make an agreement. I mean, for example, with North Korea, it's been found that there have been deals made, but they often aren't exactly implemented, at least the way the United States anticipated. And then finally, what are the costs? It's not costless to enter into negotiations. It often will establish a precedent. It may be a good one, it may not be not so good. What's interesting about this whole area, and I just want to mention it because it intrigues me, and in my stories I deal with this, is I think that people, including policymakers and leaders, can make decisions and think both intuitively and analytically. Dan Kahneman's most recent book, Amos Tversky, his partner, who was a dear colleague of mine when I was at Stanford, his latest book develops a notion which, in fact, has been in psychology for some time, that analytic thinking is slow, ponderous, difficult. Assessing costs and benefits, it's hard work. Intuition is quick. It's fast. You can know things intuitively, that you might not arrive at analytically. It's not as if intuitive thinking is characteristically wrong. The difficulty is, and I found this in many of my stories, people would intuitively decide what they wanted to do, and they would then hire the analytic portion of their mind as their lawyer to build the case and to look at the world selectively, to find the facts that justified the conclusion they'd already reached. Now, what Mr. Spock wants you to do, of course, is suspend, not to ignore your intuition, but in fact, use the analytic portion of your mind more like a judge rather than a lawyer that really tries to assess, the full range of considerations. There are also considerations of legitimacy, morality, identity, and self-respect. I'll give you a small example. The head of a small startup company in California entered into a joint venture with a very large Japanese company. The license deal, the joint venture agreement, explicitly prohibited the Japanese company from exploiting the invention in China. The American company discovered that, in fact, they were secretly doing so. And when confronted, the Japanese company responded, "Let's negotiate. Let's include China. By the way, your license fees are much too high." And the reaction of the founder of the company and the CEO, after being told his legal alternatives were not strong because it was not going to be easy to get jurisdiction over the Japanese company, and you sure couldn't sue them in China, and the Japanese courts would take a decade. It was a very powerful argument that, in fact, in terms of costs and benefits, you should negotiate. But the CEO said, "I cannot do it." "Why can't you do it?" He said, "I can't do business with someone that behaves that way. I'd rather take my chances in the lawsuit, and we may not win it." And he was asked, "Were you worried about the impact of your reputation with others if you chose to negotiate in this context?" And he said, "No, I'm not worried about my reputation with others. I'm worried about my reputation with myself, the kind of person I want to be." All right? Well, in fact, there are circumstances where choosing to negotiate poses these issues that really can go to identity and morality. Let me just very briefly, I'm not going to go into any detail, tell you about a couple of the other stories in the book, and then I'm going to conclude. A couple of stories involve individuals having to decide whether to negotiate with an evil regime. Rudolf Kastner was a Hungarian Jew who chose to negotiate with Adolf Eichmann after the Nazis had taken over Hungary. Through this negotiation, the infamous proposal of guns for lives was made by Eichmann, where Eichmann believed the rhetoric that world Jewry was all powerful. And the proposal was made, if the Jews could provide 10,000 trucks that we Scouts Honor will use only on the Eastern Front, the Jews of Hungary will be saved. Well, Kastner, needless to say, was somewhat skeptical. But what he was able to do was he and Eichmann agreed that one of Kastner's colleagues would be sent off to Istanbul to make this proposal, which, by the way, both got to Great Britain and the United States. But given that, of course, we were committed to unconditional surrender, there was no way in the world there was going to be this kind of exchange. But Kastner was able to persuade Eichmann to demonstrate that he was serious. He should let, it turned out, 1,700 Hungarian Jews leave Hungary, and these 1,700, on what has come to be called Kastner's train, ended up eventually getting to Switzerland, and those lives were saved. This was presumably a goodwill gesture. Well, after the war, Kastner ended up going to Palestine, and after independence, he had a sort of lower-level bureaucratic job in Israel. He, of course, thought of himself as kind of a great hero. But an old man who was a Hungarian who had come to Palestine earlier, who had lost his family in the Holocaust, accused Kastner of treason. And Kastner and the government sued the old man for criminal libel. And there was, in 1954, what was then a remarkable trial. The trial court ended up writing the cruelest opinion imaginable, saying Kastner had made a bargain with the devil, that in exchange for saving some members of his family and some of the Hungarian Jewish elite, although Kastner had known about the plans, he had known all about Auschwitz and the plans to round up and murder hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, Kastner instead had chosen to pursue this bargaining. It was an incredibly cruel opinion, and it was also inaccurate in many ways. And eventually, the Israeli Supreme Court reversed that opinion. But in the meantime, Kastner was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish zealot who saw him as a traitor. So you bargain with the devil and don't have complete success, it can be not so easy. Sharansky was someone who refused to bargain. I've got a chapter about him. Natan Sharansky was a refusenik in the Soviet Union. He was arrested. He was imprisoned for 9 years. He was offered continuously, he was in solitary confinement for 400 days. He suffered a lot. And the KGB offered him any number of times the following deal. His wife had already been allowed to emigrate to Israel. Sharansky was told, if you simply renounce your cause, your Zionist cause, you only have to serve a year or two. You'll be released. You'll then be allowed to emigrate. And the KGB said to him, and by the way, once you've emigrated, we know what you'll do. You'll renounce your own confession. Something like, for example, the British sailors that were captured by the Iranians. They went on Iranian television and said they were spies and everything. When they got back to Great Britain, they said, of course, we were coerced. And he refused. He wouldn't make any deal. Well, after 9 years, the United States traded a Soviet spy for Sharansky. Sharansky didn't know that. But with a KGB man, he was flown to East Berlin. And as he and the KGB guy left the plane, the KGB guy with gun in hand said, walk straight to that car. Walk in a straight line, don't deviate. And Sharansky said, I haven't made any deals with you so far. What makes you think I will now? And he purposely walked in a crooked line. He wouldn't bargain. Well, my advice is not too radical. It's that you should systematically compare expected costs and benefits. Churchill benefited hugely by having to think it through and discuss it in a war cabinet where he was discussing it with people whom he trusted but had different points of view. That Halifax was in the war cabinet, in fact, was, in my view, extremely valuable. And I think a very important, if you ever find yourself in this situation, is you should get advice from others. I also, in the book, argue that there should be a presumption in favor of negotiating. It's a rebuttable presumption, though. You should not always be prepared to negotiate. And the reason, though, I'd have a presumption is because I think these traps are so powerful, especially when you're dealing with an adversary you see as evil, that a presumption at least puts the burden of proof on you to demonstrate why you shouldn't. And then finally, and this is probably one of the most controversial, I think when you're deciding on behalf of others or an organization, I don't think your own moral intuitions should override a pragmatic assessment of the costs and benefits. One of the things that deeply troubled me about the rhetoric of President George W. Bush is his moral intuitions were not the same as my moral intuitions, and yet I had a feeling that often American foreign policy was being driven by those moral intuitions. I think President Obama is very different in that regard, and I think his Nobel speech indicated that he's, of course, not a pacifist, and he is at times prepared to use force, but on the other hand, I think he works very hard at trying to assess the costs and benefits, and I think he operates with the presumption that one ought to try to negotiate. Well, my publisher told me that when I wrote the book, I should have an elevator speech. And in my last 30 seconds, I'm going to give you my elevator speech. This book's about whether you should bargain with the devil. And it poses this question: should you bargain with the devil? And my answer is, not always. But more often than you feel like it. And more often than you feel like it for two very different reasons. First, you will often not feel like it because emotions are getting in the way of clear thinking. But a second reason you may not feel like it really poses a deeper and more profound set of problems. And that is, being prepared to bargain with the devil characteristically means you're willing to give up the pursuit, to some degree, of justice. Justice is characteristically backward-looking. It wants to rectify wrongs committed in the past. And in fact, what I argue, because I am a pragmatist, is that instead you should make decisions primarily by looking to the future and assessing the costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. My first thinking also went to Obama when he delivered his Nobel speech here in Oslo, and he said, "There is evil in the world, let there be no doubt about it."
Right.
And that was the assumption. And I was reminded of that when I heard the Norwegian Prime Minister speak on the very night of the terror acts in Oslo and at Utøya last summer, when he said, "Evil has hit us." But interestingly, whereas you juxtapose evil against the medicalization of the acts, the juxtaposition that I read in the Prime Minister's statements is evil versus politics. It took a very long time before the politics entered into the official analysis of the terror acts in Norway last summer. I could only speculate as to why that is, but I think part of the reason may be that if the politics had been at the forefront of that analysis, then the interpretation would potentially also have been more divisive in Norwegian society. Because ultimately this was an attack on a particular political movement whose youth was in fact
Yes.
clearly intentionally targeted. And that wasn't the overriding analysis. The overriding analysis presented by the Prime Minister and others was very much the analysis that evil had hit Norway as a nation.
Not that this was just a political conflict.
The political interpretation of it stayed in the background for a long, long time. It started to be more foregrounded over the past, I'd say over the past few months, in fact, but it's still not entirely there at the foreground, although the most clearly political interpretations we've seen came out on the 1st of May this year, which of course is the labor movement's main day. And there you had statements which were very clearly about how this was an attack on a particular movement and a particular party. No, I'm not the commentator here, so I should really leave the floor to Scott. You may remain seated, Professor Mnookin.
I'll just sit next to you. I'm going to just kind of raise it to a different, or at least I'm just going to indulge myself and speak to what I think is interesting and the things that come to mind for myself. First of all, before I go any further, I want to say something, and it was your last line that really hit me. And I'd never thought of this before, and that is, justice looks backwards and bargaining looks forwards. And I think this is extremely interesting, and it never, ever entered into my head before. It's actually quite profound. And what is interesting in both of these regards, if I think of the ideal judicial process, it's one in which it's not meting out punishments, but it's actually trying to ascertain not only what happened, but why it happened. And I think there's some element of that happening as the trial's going on here in Norway, is that there's some effort to ascertain what happened. Now, fundamentally, information is the fundamental problem, and understanding why, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty. But uncertainty in information is also fundamental to looking forward. In fact, that's the whole thing. That's why, well, I'm trained as a game theorist, so I'm going to enter this from, we had a brief discussion before, and he made a comment about my econometrics work. Actually, my self-identity is more on my game theory side. And that's where I came from.
I saw Tom Schelling, by the way, who was one of my professors 2 weeks ago.
Oh, that's phenomenal.
He's 91.
If we're going to talk about heroes, there's my hero.
Exactly. Me too.
He's incredible.
He's the reason I'm in this field.
He's such an intellect. What I want to talk about is uncertainty and the role of information. And I think there's something, when we classically look at bargaining, what we do is we think about what's the intention of the other side, what's their behavior. And you spoke about this, I think, in a really nice way about how when it's about us, then we flavor it and put it in context, and we understand all the nuance. And it's the other side, and the further they are from our position, the more alien or the less context and the less forgiving we are. So all the behavior we put into these shortcuts, information shortcuts, we don't know, so we just say, oh, it's that type. And we characterize it as type with no clear distribution as to there's a flavoring or a shading or anything like that. You impose a clarity to the things that you really feel uncertainty about. We also don't know about costs. We don't know how much this is going to cost us. We don't even know fighting. What's the cost of the fight? We don't know in terms of litigation. We don't know how much this is going to cost. You might have an estimation, but there's so many parameters that we don't know. And certainly if we enter into a war, how do you ever estimate what the costs are? It's extraordinarily difficult, and there's so many parameters. There are so many unforeseen consequences. Now, there's more than this, and that's the classic way that game theory deals with different forms of information, of different aspects of uncertainty. There's all these notions of perfect information, incomplete information, and all of these things. But there's something more basic to game theory, and it's a principle called common knowledge. And what it presumes is that we all both understand the deal and what we're bargaining about, and what the nature of the choices are, and what our outcomes will be. Those are tremendous assumptions. They're huge. And when we talk about a bargain, now in a court case for a contingency, then we get a better idea, and it's closer to a defined game, and I think we do come close to meeting common knowledge assumptions. But as soon as we get into a field of warfare, How do you know? What are those options? What happens down the line? What are the choices that are going to be coming up? What are the choices available to you now? You don't even know what those choices are. And does the other guy know the choices? How do we even, if we're even to talk about all those things I talked about before, if we don't even know the parameters of the structure of the game, how do we even understand or analytically ascertain it? And I think we as human beings and the movement in behavioral economics, and I really like this aspect where you're bringing in social behavior, behavioral psychology into your legal framework, which I think is peppered with an economist's perspective, given your background. But there's a really nice melding of all of these things together in a really interesting way. He's not my favorite person. He's definitely not my hero. But there is a really elegant way to think about information, and it was by Rumsfeld when he made the little statement about known knowns. Now that's an environment where information's not a problem. And then there are known unknowns, and that basically means, well, I know that this is something that's going to be a probabilistic outcome, and it'll go this way or it'll go that way. There are also unknown knowns, but those are still within kind of a game theoretic structure. I can lay it out. What's really problematic are the unknown unknowns, and that's really where we get into a real problem with the notion of bargaining. Because, okay, I agree to bargain, but I don't even know what that means and what are the parameters. And this is actually why we have all these pre-bargaining arrangements, because it's our human nature to try to at least try to address those things so that we can get to that point. And I think that we should appreciate that, why you need to have that pre-bargaining phase, because it's so necessary to address this fundamental information problem. You already have so many problems with the known unknowns and the unknown knowns, but it's these unknown unknowns that are the real issue that are so problematic. Now with that as kind of the over-enveloping atmosphere that I want to... Was that me?
It may have been my fault.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn this off.
There were a couple things that I wanted to just kind of balloons I wanted to raise. That's the big one I wanted to paint the picture. But I think it's all there. It's just not with my, as I said, I was going to be self-indulgent, and that's how I viewed your work. But there were some things that I think is really are issues that could be another book or things that are there, but I think timing is really of incredibly important. People talk about, Zartman in particular talks about ripeness and the concepts of ripeness. Personally, I know what he means by ripeness. I think people think it is, but what that really means in the real world, I have no idea. And it seems more like an old joke about baseball, about the umpire just saying, I calls them as I sees them. It's not very satisfying in many ways. The one thing, though, about timing, and that is where we have these pre-agreements, and we kind of testing the water, using back channels. All of these things, in some way, start to reveal information, and they start to address those common knowledge assumptions. So at least we know what the parameters that we're going to be playing with. We'll never address, it's always forward-looking. We'll never know the future. We'll always have unintended consequences. There'll always be, but at least we'll know what we're dealing with. And that's something that we're going to, it's just so human that you're going to have that opening. The other thing I want to raise is procedures matter. You're a lawyer, you know this more than all else, but another game theorist is Steve Brams at NYU, and he has a marvelous, extremely pragmatic notion about how to, it's basically a book is called Fair Division. And it's as simple as how I split all the nice little pastries and things like that with my brother. We're nearly the same age. We always wanted it. And basically the solution was one of us cut, the other guy got to choose. And it's simple kinds of solutions like that that actually are so elegant, but it's the procedure that matters. It wasn't in my mother that if she sliced it, oh, we would probably start boxing with each other because we would have an argument about this side is bigger than the other one. But if one of us divided it, well, that was how we divided it. And that was going to be down to the finest molecule in terms of a fine division. And I think that there's an aspect of this, that there are procedures that can be established by which you also provide, you gain authority to those who are part of the bargaining process that's important. Now, that in itself leads to a problem, though. And that is the problem of, at least for civil wars, that I do a lot and worked a lot on power sharing. And one of the inherent problems of power sharing is that it inherently, at one level, it sounds wonderful. Everybody who's been party to the war is invited into the table. Everybody gets a say. We get a piece of the pie. And it kind of seems like a Brahms solution to the problem. The problem really is that the bargaining is all conducted at the elite level. And those who are not elites often are left out of the table. And a fundamental problem with this is when elite bargains occur, there's unintended consequences for those who aren't at the bargaining table. They may often, and many things that occur when elite bargaining occurs, there may be lots and lots of rhetoric about land reform and things like that. Gets down to the bargaining table. What's the first thing that goes out? It's those aspects that do not necessarily, because where is the authority of that individual vested by their position, and who matters most for those people in those positions is another thing. And I'll end with one final example that I've wrestled with for years. Actually, ever since I first read the article by Savage, who's also at NYU now. But he wrote a really interesting analysis of meetings and bargains. And he came up with the counterintuitive solution, and it's a very compelling solution, and that is the more open the meeting, the less likely it is that a bargain will be achieved. Because those that are involved in the bargain are always looking over their shoulder at those that they're responsible for. So in the example that you gave about Nelson Mandela, if he was looking over his shoulder, he decided, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to take this on, and it was a closed room. And there's part of me that's ideologically so committed to full and open information, and this is why I struggle with this, but the role of information sometimes, there is a place sometimes for not consulting the others, but that's the dilemma. Elite bargains are going to create problems by which people are left out, but there's also times by which there's options that are available that only an individual in a closed environment not worrying about their constituency is going to push forward. And I don't know if there's one easy answer for that, but it's a fundamental problem. And I think that's a nice way, and I'll end in this way. The juxtaposition of histories that is portrayed here it really draws these dilemmas out about when and when not to bargain. And I'll end with that just as a general overview is there's something, I think there's just a really nice way of doing that really serves to, I guess, really portray the types of dilemmas that I'm talking about by these juxtapositionings. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that set of comments, which includes nothing. I agree with it all. In fact, let me give you I'm sorry?
Oh, microphone. You need your microphone. Now we didn't get those nice words on the camera.
I'll say it again. I agree with everything you said. And if I could just very briefly make a couple comments. First, your last point. In preparing for this afternoon, there were two things I wanted to talk about, I wanted to mention. I mentioned one, and that was evil. All right? The other thing I was going to talk about was secrecy, because the original director of PRIO, in his little essay, either his first or second principle was, of course, if you're going to bargain with the devil, transparency. I think I basically disagree. For reasons you've described, most international negotiations, in Bob Putnam's words, involve at least a two-level game, and that is their domestic.
Oh, I was going to mention him.
They're domestic constituents. I mean, no, you did. You made the point.
Okay.
And in protracted, difficult conflicts, without having the possibility of private discussions, it politically can be, at least in a democracy of any sort, impossible.
Yeah.
Because those who oppose dealing with the enemy will be allowed to mobilize before you can really explore, through some exchange of information, what might be possible. So I think I completely agree with you, and I think what it suggests is that, like all principles, transparency has its limits, and that in terms of negotiation, particularly in protracted, ideologically driven negotiations, secrecy is often indispensable. Oslo, after all, for which your country deservedly gets a lot of credit, was done almost entirely secretly. Because I assure you, if in fact within Israel or among Palestinians it had been known what was being discussed, it couldn't have happened. Yeah. All right? Second, your Rumsfeld quote I adore, and indeed my contracts exam last year was to give the quote and ask the students for an hour and a half to write an essay applying that quote, known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, to the way American contract law tries to allocate power and responsibilities to deal with them. So I love that. I don't love Rumsfeld, but I certainly, I certainly love that quote.
Well, you always refer to, you don't refer to evil most of the time. You refer to evil acts. So that's...
No, exactly, because I think it, although, you know, I'm probably prepared. I also talk about evil regimes, though. Yeah. I think there are regimes that are evil. And I think there are probably some people that I think have maybe earned the characterization as perhaps evil people, too. Finally, I think that what you say is fascinating. And I think part of, I in fact, am in this field because as an undergraduate, I was so intrigued with what I learned from Tom Schelling. And I think strategic interaction, which for me is part of the core of at least non-formal game theory, and that is the notion that each side is making decisions trying to keep in mind what they think the other side's reaction to their decisions are going to be, knowing that the other side's reactions, you know, et cetera. And I think that, in fact, a problem, I think formal game theory often offers interesting insights, but as you acknowledge, in the real world, the assumptions characteristically are nowhere near met in terms of common knowledge, in terms of being able to have a well-specified game where you can't bring in new parties. Yeah. You know, so I think that that can often constrain what we can do. But I very much appreciate your interesting comments, and I think that what I so appreciate is that you understand my aspiration for the book. And in fact, my own work, my own academic career as someone who's interested in both the theory and practice of negotiation, dispute resolution. I'm a member of the Law and Reality School in the sense that I'm interested in how the world actually works, but I think theory is enormously helpful. And I think the wonderful thing about being a law professor, at least in the United States, is we can borrow and steal from everybody. I mean, in the sense, in terms of trying to use different prisms to analyze behavior. Thank you. Be glad to take questions.